Hello and welcome to this video. It's the continuation on the video on context. Everything you see in this video comes from Mr. Bruff's Guide to A-Level English Literature, which was written by Kerry Lewis, an absolutely wonderful teacher and expert on A-Level studies. And she's written the definitive guide to the subject, so do pick up a copy at mrbruff.com or amazon.co.uk. So we're continuing from the previous video on different contexts. AO3 is the understanding of the significance and influence of the contexts in which literary texts are written and received. Now I'm going to go through 5 more contexts in this video, beginning with literary context. It's always interesting to investigate texts that are referenced within the poems, plays or novels that you're studying. In Northanger Abbey, Jane Austen says, Milton, Pope and Prior, with a paper from The Spectator and a chapter from Sterne, are eulogized by 1,000 pens. This reflects contemporary attitudes to literature, which was expected to improve the mind. References to contemporary literature can also tell you a lot about the characters. In Northanger Abbey, Isabella lends her new friend, the naive Catherine, a sensationalist Gothic romance, The Mysteries of Udolpho by Anne Radcliffe. Isabella also waxes lyrical about Castle of Wolfenbach, Clermont, Mysterious Warnings, Necromancer of the Black Forest, Midnight Bell, Orphan of the Rhine, and Horrid Mysteries. By the titles she refers to, it's quite clear that they're not novels that were written to improve the mind, as they fall into the Gothic genre that was so popular at the time. Austen, therefore, through Isabella's choice of reading matter, hints that she is not a desirable friend for our heroine Catherine. At the time, novels were frowned upon, and Austen wryly comments on contemporary attitudes, undervaluing the labour of the novelist and of slighting the performances which have only genius, wit and taste to recommend them. It's amusing to note that reading novels was generally considered an inferior type of literature and a form of teenage rebellion in Austen's time. You might also want to read other texts by the same author, looking for similarities and differences in characterization, themes, language, form and structure. Another context to consider is political context. This links to the political background of a text and sometimes the author's political views, which might be linked to the social context. In order to appreciate Les Miserables by Victor Hugo, it helps to understand the political and socialist context of the French Revolution, which began with the storming of the Bastille in 1789. It's then easier to appreciate Hugo's vision of 19th century French politics as, 43 years after the revolution began, his main characters symbolised larger problems within 19th century French society. Les Miserables is therefore about the legacy of the French Revolution. Politics might also influence decisions about what to include or omit in a text. Shakespeare wrote Macbeth knowing full well that the reigning monarch, King James I of England, also the King of Scotland, was interested in witches. The king, who had written a book about witches and was responsible for the persecution, arrest, torture and execution of many innocent women, was also the patron of Shakespeare's acting company. It made sense, therefore, for Shakespeare to include witches in the opening scene of the play to attract royal interest. Not only that, but King James I was also known to be a descendant of Banquo, and this fulfills the witch's prophecy in the play that his descendants would rule. It would have pleased the king to watch confirmation in the play of his divine right to rule. Religious or philosophical context. An awareness of the religious or philosophical context is definitely going to help you to understand people's ways of thinking. For example, in John Webster's The Duchess of Malfi, first performed around 1613, there's a corrupt, murderous cardinal of the Roman Catholic Church. His character is so evil that in 1618, Orazio Busino, the chaplain to the Venetian ambassador to England, complained about how Catholics, particularly the character of the cardinal, were depicted. It's unlikely the Protestant audience had much sympathy for his views. Some would have lived through Queen Mary's persecution of Protestants, 1554 to 58. Others will have been familiar with John Fox's The Book of Martyrs, published in 1563, which describes the religious persecution of Protestants by Catholics. It would also have been common knowledge that Queen Elizabeth I was excommunicated from the Catholic Church in 1570, and that the Catholic Mary Queen of Scots, executed for treason in 1587, had unsuccessfully plotted to overthrow her. The idea that God was on the side of the Protestants would have been confirmed in 1588 when England defeated the Catholic Spanish Armada. Social and economic context then. So as stated but just previously, the social and economic contexts are often connected. The legal context might also be important. For example, when the New Poor Law was introduced in 1834, it had a huge impact on the destitute. From this year onwards, they had to go to workhouses where families were split up and were given workhouse clothes and poor quality food. They were forced to toil for long hours to pay for their keep. And the philosophy behind this was that the unemployed poor people were in that position because they were too lazy to work. The workhouse therefore served as a deterrent. The poor would regard the conditions as so appalling they would rather look for work. Now, Charles Dickens strongly disagreed with this philosophy, as he knew that unemployed people were not necessarily lazy. At the age of 12, his father was in prison for debt, and Dickens had no choice but to leave school and work. Having lived through poverty, he was sympathetic towards the plight of the poor, and in his novel Oliver Twist uses sarcasm to ridicule the very sage, deep philosophical men on the poor law boards. They established the rule that all poor people should have the alternative of being starved by a gradual process in the workhouse or by a quick one out of it. As a result of his early experience, many of his novels, such as A Christmas Carol and Hard Times, are social commentaries dealing with the theme of poverty. Theatrical context then. The theatrical context can reveal a lot about the attitudes of a contemporary audience. Consider the date that a play was first performed and the nature of the theatre goers. Did people from a range of social classes go to the theatre, or were plays aimed at the elite? What were the norms of social behaviour at the time, and to what extent did playwrights conform to or challenge these norms? For example, this guy, Richard Sheridan, in his The Rivals, 1775, he wrote at a time when people followed elaborate codes of learned, socially acceptable behaviour. Consequently, the characters in his plays are constrained by the rules of politeness and good breeding. And Sheridan satirises this concept through some of his characters challenging the notion of conforming, and instead they display elements of modern individualism. Consider too the reaction of a contemporary audience and contrast it with those of a modern audience. Well, those are some of the contexts you need to think about. In the next video, we'll look at how do we use that knowledge of context in A-level analysis.